Today we'll focus on 5 myths about the U.S. Army in World War II. If you're interested in history, I can almost guarantee you've encountered some of these myths. So fix bayonets and change out those skivvies, because we're going on the offensive. Myth number 1, the U.S. Army didn't fight in the Pacific. When most people picture U.S. troops in the Pacific during World War II, they picture Marines. After all, the Marines handled the Pacific while the Army fought in Europe and North Africa, right? At maximum strength, the Marines fielded 6 divisions in the Pacific, amounting to about 250,000 Marines. The Army, on the other hand, fielded 22 divisions in that same region. Plus, there were additional combat groups, totaling almost 2 million soldiers in theater. This made the Army the primary U.S. land fighting force in the Pacific theater. Throughout the war in the Pacific, Army logistical troops worked hard to supply U.S. soldiers. They also provided support to the Marine Corps, who relied almost entirely on the Army and Navy. Army ground troops were landing on island after island, engaging in brutal fighting. Army medical personnel operated the majority of the field hospitals. The U.S. Army Air Forces were pouring it on the Japanese from above. Army leadership was dictating the strategy of the war. I could keep going on, but you get my point. My intention is not to discredit the contributions of the brave Marines in the Pacific. In fact, I believe that the efforts of both the Army and the Marines are often underrepresented, and they don't get the spotlight they deserve. So if the Army had more troops in the Pacific and did more of the fighting, why do so many people associate the devil dogs with the Pacific theater? First, the Marines had better PR than the Army. Even during the war, many headlines focused on the Marines. The Marines built a reputation as an elite outfit of fighters. Stories of this relatively small group of elite troops hammering the Japanese made for great reading. History News Network has a great article about the U.S. Army in the Pacific. This narrative includes quotes from U.S. Army soldiers regarding the media frenzy surrounding the Marines during that period. Out here, mention is seldom seen of the achievements of the Army ground troops, whereas the Marines are blown up to the skies. A junior officer also expressed his thoughts in a letter to his family. He wrote, "The Marines are so hopped up with their publicity. Someone has to fight them, and I'm the guy." He continued, "Our men are getting awfully tired of reading about the exploits of the Marines out here. It has become common for us to identify pictures of Marines in action as being pictures of Army troops. The standing joke now is that the Marines' secret weapon is the Army. The Marines led the charge in many famous battles, suffering very high casualties. The Marines didn't receive all this focus without reason. While it's true that the Army did more of the overall fighting in the Pacific, U.S. Marines landed in the first waves at Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and more. This was incredibly dangerous, leading to a much higher casualty rate for the Marines than the U.S. Army overall. These large-scale operations naturally made lots of headlines. Although the Army was involved in all those operations, the focus was often on the Marines leading the charge. The Pacific was the Marines' primary focus during the war. In contrast, the Army was also engaged in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. While there were exceptions, the Marines focused almost exclusively on fighting the Japanese. Meanwhile, the Army was also engaged in battles against Germany and Italy. This led the public to associate the Marines with fighting the Japanese and the Army with the other Axis countries. The Marines are seen as badass, fighting in many high-profile battles. However, far more media has been produced about the Marines in the Pacific than about the Army. Films like Gung Ho, Sanzavir, Iwo Jima, The Pacific, Flags of Our Fathers, and Windtalkers are just a few examples. Both the U.S. Army and the Marines contributed heavily to the fighting in the Pacific. So, next time you hear someone repeat the myth that the Marines did it all, make sure to set them straight. This next myth is so popular that I often hear people talk about it like it's common knowledge. Myth number 2 is that the U.S. Sherman tanks were inferior compared to the superior German tanks. People often imagine the M4 Sherman as this puny little tank. The Sherman tank has often been unfairly criticized for being outclassed by German tanks. It turned into a flaming death trap whenever it was hit by enemy fire. Frankly, I won't stand for this Sherman tank slander any longer. I believe there are three main reasons why the Sherman tank is discredited today. I'm not planning to list reasons for every myth, but this is how it's working out. First, many people focus on early versions of the Sherman, which had some issues. The biggest issue was their reputation for catching fire when hit by the enemy. This was a problem early on, but the military fixed it quickly by moving ammo racks. They also added wet ammo stowage, which helped prevent fires if the ammo was hit. This change didn't make it impossible for Shermans to catch fire, but it reduced burn rates. Even before this, Shermans didn't burn at a higher rate than other tanks of the time. That problem wasn't unique to the Sherman. It affected many tanks. A penetrating hit that set the ammo on fire would likely disable the tank anyway. Later versions of the Sherman had thicker armor and other improvements. These upgrades helped to increase the tank's survivability in combat. Even among Shermans that burned, crews often managed to bail out safely. Similarly, German tanks weren't kraut roasters as many people suggest. Second, people place too much emphasis on tank versus tank comparisons. Don't get me wrong, I love comparing tank statistics like any other World War II enthusiast. However, these comparisons are mostly useless in determining battlefield effectiveness. Contrary to popular belief, tank strategy during World War II wasn't about duels. Tanks often worked closely with infantry to assault enemy positions. While tanks did encounter each other, enemy tanks were only about 15% of their targets. The majority of targets were buildings, fortifications, personnel, and anti-tank guns. In addition to the rarity of tank-on-tank encounters, comparisons are often unrealistic. These comparisons are frequently stacked against the Sherman tank. Oh, you're likely to see misleading statistics that don't tell the full story. This comparison leads some to conclude that the Sherman was a terrible design. However, this conclusion is nonsense. Many tanks compared to the Sherman were in a different class. Moreover, these tanks were not frequently encountered by Shermans. For instance, people claim there were only 3 verified cases of U.S. troops encountering German Tiger I tanks from Normandy through the end of the war. However, these numbers are hard to verify, as U.S. troops often misidentified German tanks. They frequently reported other German tanks as being Tigers. In reality, heavy tanks like Tigers and Panthers weren't common, and support not for tank duels. German heavies were behemoths built around a different doctrine. Maybe we should have designed another type of vehicle specifically to destroy those German tanks. We could call it a destroyer tank or something along those lines. But that seems like a silly idea. Even then, they weren't always dueling. Additionally, Sherman's German counterparts had larger-than-life reputations. German heavy tanks weren't really that common on the battlefield. In fact, one reason they were uncommon was due to mechanical failures. The Sherman was a reliable vehicle, easy to maintain. The U.S. focused on simple, practical tanks, while the Germans aimed for the largest and most complicated tanks in history. Believe it or not, this approach didn't exactly pay off for them. People often share sayings like the Tiger was as good as 5 Shermans. But the Americans always had 6 Shermans. There's even a subreddit dedicated to these comparisons. In the real world, later war variants of the Shermans with 76mm guns had plenty of power. They could effectively knock out those formidable German tanks. In many cases, even the 75mm guns were sufficient depending on the circumstances. I even found one period report of a measly M8 Greyhound knocking out a German Tiger tank with its 37mm gun. Such reports illustrate the unpredictability of tank warfare. Let's talk about the millimeter gun. U.S. troops were notoriously bad at identifying German tank models, so it could have been something else entirely. These German tanks are often viewed as superior to Shermans today. However, even a German Tiger tank with an 88mm gun didn't have the range to knock out U.S. tanks. from the ditch that it broke down in, 10 miles behind the line. So no, the Sherman tank did not suck. It wasn't made to max out its dueling stats on paper. It was made to win the war. The Sherman was versatile, reliable, easy to produce and maintain, and just overall more effective. Check right now to make sure you're subscribed to World War Wisdom so you don't miss more videos like this. Okay, now let's keep cruising along with the next myth. Myth number 3. The U.S. Army banned camo uniforms because they were too similar to the German camouflage. According to this myth, the U.S. Army issued out camo uniforms to some soldiers in Europe, but then had to stop using the uniforms entirely due to a high number of reported friendly fire incidents, in which U.S. troops shot their own comrades who were wearing camouflage because they thought they were Germans. To bust this myth, let's break it down into smaller pieces. First, did the Army issue camouflage uniforms in Europe? Yes, a test batch of frogskin camo fatigues were issued out to some U.S. soldiers in the summer of 1944. These uniforms were mainly used by troops in the 2nd Armored Division, but they were also used by some troops in the 2nd and 30th Infantry Divisions. To be clear, these were not the same as the iconic camouflage uniforms worn by Marines in the Pacific. Okay, next. Were U.S. troops being mistaken for Germans because of these uniforms and shot by friendlies? No, we have no evidence that this ever happened to anyone. Now, of course, with all the fighting that was going on, it's impossible for me to conclusively say that this never once happened. But there were never any reports of this, and it definitely didn't happen on a large scale like some people think. The YouTube channel World War II TV has a great video discussing this myth. In their video, they mention that there were reports of friendly fire incidents caused by U.S. uniforms. That looked like German ones, but not the camo fatigues. Reportedly, there were friendly fire incidents in Normandy caused by the new solid-colored dark green fatigue uniforms, and possibly the M43 field jacket as well. Then the previous M41 jacket, which was easily recognizable due to its light color and waist length. And finally, did the Army have to stop using? Were these uniforms discontinued due to reports of friendly fire incidents? Absolutely not. As we discussed, there were no reports of friendly fire incidents caused by these uniforms. In fact, other uniforms did cause reported incidents, yet those remained in service. So, if it wasn't friendly fire that led to the discontinuation of these camo uniforms, what was it? Additionally, they were more complicated and costly to produce than solid-colored fatigues. Most importantly, the camo pattern wasn't very effective, making soldiers more visible to the enemy. So why were they used at all? These uniforms were only issued in a small test batch. Once that batch wore out, troops simply returned to the standard uniforms. It wasn't that the Army pulled these uniforms from the front lines, they just tested one batch. From this, you can see how the myth became widespread. These U.S. camo uniforms do resemble some German camouflage patterns, but that's irrelevant. This next myth could apply to many conflicts, but let's focus on World War II. Myth number 4. The airborne and elite Army units did all the heavy lifting. The airborne, Rangers, and 1st Special Service Force were seen as the elite troops who won the war. This often leads to forgetting about the other 99% of the U.S. Army. I understand why there's so much focus on these specialized World War II units. They were unique and super interesting, standing out from the regular infantry divisions. For instance, the 101st Airborne Division was specially trained for airborne operations. They used custom gear and participated in some of the war's most famous battles. Naturally, these elite units stand out compared to the Army's 68th Standard Infantry Divisions. The Standard Infantry Divisions often blend together in people's minds, yet they were the backbone of the U.S. Army throughout the war. From the Philippines to Sicily, these conventional GIs faced the enemy daily. They mounted attacks, repelled assaults, and held the line consistently. Specialized units were often reserved for specific missions, gaining more attention. Consequently, regular GIs living on the front lines received less recognition. For example, the airborne comprised around 18% of the troops invading occupied France on D-Day, as more soldiers poured onto the beaches in the days that followed. WWII, the contributions of standard infantry became increasingly vital in securing victory. During those days, the percentage of paratroopers dropped significantly. These paratroopers had a very important and dangerous job. However, their job wasn't to win the war by themselves. Some people may think the airborne outshone the rest of the army troops. The airborne kicked open the door to France for the rest of the army. This allowed the rest of the army to pour in and join the fight. It's a similar story with the Army Rangers, who had crucial missions on D-Day. They fought bravely, suffering many casualties in the process. The Rangers were a smaller force, making up roughly 1% of U.S. troops. The inflated perception of these units comes from pop culture overexposure. These unique units and their missions often create compelling narratives. A small, specialized group taking on a high-risk mission is a perfect narrative formula. Making a movie about a regular infantry division can be more challenging. These divisions are the ones out there getting the job done. Examples like the Airborne and Rangers are popular for a reason. Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan focus on these elite units. These films have elevated these units in many people's minds. Maybe I'll make a super accurate World War II movie one day. It could be about a kid drafted into a unit you've never heard of. He ends up becoming a typist. Logistically important, yet super boring. This kind of story might not sell too many tickets, but who knows? I don't see an issue depicting these specialized units. They are fascinating. They deserve all the credit they get for their bravery. Let's remember to credit the rest of the army for their contributions. Conventional troops may not always be in the spotlight, but they were vital. The bravery of these GIs and troops from other nations secured victory for the Allies. Now, let's move on to the final myth for today. I'm often surprised by how popular this myth is. Myth number 5. Women could not serve in the U.S. Army during World War II. Many people are familiar with Rosie the Riveter and women working in factories. These women supported the war effort in significant ways. Many people are aware of our troops overseas, but fewer realize that some were women. That's right. Women served in every branch of the U.S. military during World War II. Over 350,000 women joined the military before the war ended. These women didn't serve in combat roles, but they filled crucial logistical and support jobs. While nursing was an important job, it wasn't the only one they filled. Let's quickly go through the important jobs women held in each branch. The U.S. Coast Guard had the SPARS, which stands for Semper Paratus, always ready. Women in the SPARS served as photographers, cooks, pharmacy assistants, and drivers. The Navy had the Navy Nurse Corps and the WWIIs. WWIIs stood for women, accepted for volunteer emergency service. Hospital work, engineering, and more were also part of their duties. Next is the Marine Corps, which had the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. The MCWR often filled clerical and mechanical roles, like aircraft maintenance. The Army Air Forces had the WWASPs, or Women's Air Force Service Pilots. These pilots ferried aircraft, towed targets for gunnery training, and served as instructors. Finally, the Army had the Army Nurse Corps and the WA. The WWII, or Women's Army Corps, filled various roles like switchboard operators. They also worked as mechanics, postal clerks, drivers, typists, and medical personnel. These jobs were not combat roles, but many were still very dangerous. Hundreds of women lost their lives while serving in World War II. Some died from accidents, like plane crashes, and others were killed by enemy fire. More than 80 nurses were taken prisoner by the enemy during the war. 3 years after the war, in 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was signed into law. This act allowed women to enlist as full permanent members in all branches of the military. Some people hear that date and assume women couldn't serve in the military before then. They might think women could only serve as nurses, overlooking their auxiliary roles. So if you hear someone say that U.S. women couldn't serve in the military during World War II, make sure to set them straight and share those fun acronyms. Some of those myths might stick with me for a long time. Please leave a comment down below to share which myths you've heard. Also, let me know about other myths that didn't make it into this video. I hate to break it to you, but now you know the truth. You're officially a history nerd, so just accept it. That sits where all of us history nerds hang out. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Remember to hype up the Sherman tank when you can. It gets a little self-conscious, and I'll see you in the next one.